Jacksonville, why I went there is that I came to feel Jacksonville had an untold story. That obviously a lot of the people who had worked there remembered things in interviews very fondly. That's something else I had discovered in my earlier research, is that when anyone started to talk about Jacksonville, I was like, oh, that was one of the most wonderful times in my life. Jean Gontier also felt that way about Jacksonville. Alice Joyce and Tom Moore fell in love there and got married in Jacksonville. Other people met their spouses there. And so you begin to see, and I began to see, well, a lot of these people met in Jacksonville. What is it about Jacksonville? And people would say, oh, and we would take the ferry, go to South Jacksonville, we'd go to Pablo Beach, we'd go there, we'd do that. We always had time to play. Mrs. James actually recounted the fact. She said, well, I asked her, what was it like in the Calum house? And she said, well, it was a boarding house, but it was like family. And she said we would have sing-alongs in the evening. Well, like Guy Coombs fell in love with Anna Q. Nielsen, would go pick strawberries and bring strawberries and cream back for Anna Q. And she said they were falling in love, and Tom Moore and Alice Joyce were falling in love, and she said we were all sitting around singing songs by the piano. And the nice thing about the Mrs. James and her knowledge of Calum and her mother and all the people who stayed there was the studio was adjacent to the boarding house. So the more I learned about it, finding pictures, she had a scrapbook of photos and all these pictures, and other people began to share these. And what happened was that each person I talked to led to another person or another story or another photograph. And so I would begin to get photos like someone would say, well, I don't know who that is, but I think he ran a music store. And so I go like, well, what music stores were there? Well, there was Potter's Music. Here's a picture of a man playing a piano, and it's a guy that does not look like an actor. I go to the music store local there in 1974, and lo and behold, the guy there says, well, that's my father, Mr. Potter. And it was like he didn't realize he had ever been in the movies. Other people, that would happen too. They go like, well, I didn't know that my father was in the movies. Or they would have a story that they knew, but they weren't quite sure what studio it would be. And by telling me enough about it, I could say, well, that was Lubin Company, or the Vim Company, or the Eagle Company, or because there were, I think, by 1915 and 16, I counted in all the reference that I had done, and I found 16 different companies were in Jacksonville around that time making films. 16 film companies. I mean, that is one of the major film centers for the silent era. I began to have such good luck, like the article that was written about what I was doing there in Jacksonville that appeared in the Florida Times-Union caught the attention of a man who had been a business manager for the Gaumont Company, and he tracks me down, calls me on the phone, and I'll never forget when he says, Mr. Gill, I'm Sidney J. Vaughn, and I read this article about you, and you know, I worked for the film business back at that time. Mr. Vaughn had worked not only with Gaumont, but Edison before. I had not yet met anyone who'd ever worked for the Edison Company, because that was the huge big company before all these other companies was Edison. And so he said he had worked for Edison as business manager, and because he knew Jacksonville so well, when Gaumont wanted to come down there, the Edison people said, well, you should talk to Sidney Vaughn. He knows everything you could possibly want to know. And what was amazing was that Mr. Vaughn left Jacksonville in 1917 and had just come back from he was retired, and he hadn't been there for 40 years. And all of a sudden, I had this wonderful resource there. And as it turned out, he was talking about this lovely girl whose mother ran a boarding house, and he said he used to date her. And I said, you don't mean Ruth Snow James, do you? And he said, well, yes. How do you know about her? And I said, I just talked with her. So I was able to bring together two people now in their advanced years who had dated in 1914 and 15. And that was one of my really fun experiences, was to ask each of them, would you like me to bring you into touch? And they got together and let me come sit there. They wouldn't let me record it, but I immediately wrote down everything when they were done. And that was a wonderful experience, because one was so proud of the work at Gaumont, the other was so proud of the work they did at Calum, that they were still sort of exchanging barbs back and forth. Like Mr. Vaughn would say, well, we weren't into all those horse operas and all those Civil War pictures like Calum. And she'd go, well, we weren't into those flighty things, like Gaumont was making. We were making films that people really wanted to see. Well, there's a lot of truth about that. And so to hear these two people resuming an argument that they may have had in 1915 was a unique experience for me. Each day I mapped out. I think, well, tomorrow I really need to go to the library for at least 2 hours and check on so-and-so, and then I better check the old city directories, and then I better also check today's telephone book. In those days, most people had their address in a telephone book. They would not use just an initial and last name. So in those days, you could, if you had addresses from the city directory, you could go to the phone book. And sure enough, they're still living in Jacksonville, and I would just pick up the phone and call. A few times people wouldn't answer their phone. I would go to their door and knock on their door. I mean, I don't think that's something I recommend that people do. I had some interesting experiences that way. One whole interview was through a screen door, because the woman appreciated my interest and knew I knew a lot, but she wasn't about to let me in the door. So I went down to City Hall and told them what I was doing, and they actually brought me out the original handwritten volumes. And I found the lease agreement between the Calum Company and the woman who owned the property, whose name was Nellie Dents. When I went back and started to tell Mrs. James and others about Nellie Dents, they go, oh, Nellie Dents, poor Nellie Dents. And I said, well, why? And it was one of the most interesting stories, was that she lived in the house right next to the Calum house. She owned Calum House and she lived next door. And Ruth Snow went to read to her because she was blind. And I said, oh, was she born blind? No, she wasn't born blind. What happened was she had a terrible headache one day, and she said to her husband, would you please go upstairs and get my headache medicine? I have a terrible headache. And he went upstairs and brought down a revolver and shot her through the head, and it didn't kill her. It blinded her. So Ruth Snow James, who knew a story that very, very few people would have actually known what had happened. And so the only reason she knew is that her mother knew this, because her mother was the same age as Nellie Dents. And so to think, wow, that happened right next door, basically. And it blinded her for life, but it didn't kill her. And but the idea of asking your husband to go get your headache medication, he apparently, the way it was told to me was, well, I guess he thought, I'll take care of your headache forever, but it didn't work. And or someone like Mary Kennedy, I mean, she knew a lot of famous people, but this was the first time she'd ever talked about Jacksonville. And I think she really enjoyed that, to talk about that, because it allowed her to go back to the beginning of her career. And the person who sort of boosted her into her career was Robert Vignola. And Robert Vignola had a brother, Tony, who ran the Messenger company. We don't think about this too much today, but back in the teens, there were messenger companies, and people were sending messages all the time. Messengers, I didn't realize that Tony Vignola was so well thought of, and so was his brother Robert, because of the messengers. When you're sending messages all the time, you really get to know the people who are your messenger boys. They were usually kids. And I don't know, things like that were another time, and it took me a while to learn all those different things. So when people would go like, well, I didn't know Robert Vignola, but I knew his brother Tony, and so I'd go ahead and ask a few questions about what was Tony like or something, because it it would tend to endear you a little bit more to people if they knew that you really cared about everybody, pretty much, you know. Mrs. James was an unusual case because her not having left Jacksonville and going to live somewhere else, she had very keen memories of what it was like, and it was a very important time to her. So I asked her, why didn't you go to Hollywood when everyone from Calum went to LA? And she said, oh, I wanted to, but my mother wouldn't let me. And I said, oh, that's too bad. But in some ways I realized, she made a few trips there, but she always came back to Jacksonville. But for me as an historian, it was luck, because if she had gone to Los Angeles, I think the keenness of the memories would have diminished, particularly if she had stayed in the business. Because the more years you're in the business, the longer you work, usually the more difficult it is to remember specific facts. Whereas her memories became somewhat locked in time. And so she remembered things in very good detail. And I never found her make a single mistake. So I was really fortunate to have her as a source, and her great love of the people in the time period in Jacksonville sort of rubbed off on me too, I think. In 1975, in July, I was hired as archivist for the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and that's a whole nother story of being there. They had a curator of collections in the late 40s, early 50s, but no one since. And in fact, the Academy's curator in the 40s was Howard Lamar Walls, who's the gentleman who discovered the paper print at the Library of Congress and got funding for the conservation of the paper prints. And I got to meet Mr. Walls in Santa Barbara. He lived there at that time. So one of the first things I did was to visit Howard Lamar Walls and let him know, hey, I'm taking you up right where you left off. Literally, his stuff, his work pages were left on a table in the basement of the Academy. So when I started my work, there was his stuff. And I said, I'm literally picking up where you left off in 1953, in 1975, all those years. And he goes, oh my God, is the stuff still there? I said, yeah, your carbons, your story, what you were working on, the paper, all the stuff about paper print project and everything. And so it was wonderful to go like, wow, I can now preserve film history and be paid for it. And also, every day I went to work, I thought everything in this building, which it was at that time, was film related. So it was like someone who loves the movies and film history, it was almost like, have I died and gone to heaven? Because every day was, going through stuff that had been collected and we didn't know what it was, and I would go through it, or I'd get new stuff, or we'd spend a lot of time identifying things that were unidentified. That most of my life seems to be identifying things that were unidentified. And one other thing that was, people say, well, how come you became interested in silent film? I think I have to give a lot of credit not only to my dad, who had a projector and would project old comedies for us, but my mother. When someone would come on the TV screen in a TV show in the 50s, she'd go, oh, that's Neil Hamilton. Oh, I had such a crush on Neil Hamilton. Or she'd say, there's never been a Western star like Ken Maynard, as far as I'm concerned. Or she'd say, Jackie Gleason is just, his poor soul is just an imitation of Lloyd Hamilton. Well, I'd hear these things growing up, and she said, the silent film should never have come to an end. That was unfortunate. It should never have happened. And I said, well, why do you say that? And she said, sound movies are one thing, but silent movies are another thing. And they are not the same thing. And there should have been people continuing to make silent films and showing them in the same setting that the silent films were, and talkies should have been in their own theaters. Well, that's an astonishing thing to say. And so I think, It's funny, actually, that I began to think that it's true. She's right. And so I think a part of my wanting to bring back the silent films is that I really think my mother's correct. Is that it's unfortunate that the theaters stopped showing silent films. But once they were wired for sound and everyone wanted to see sound, it was like no one wants to see an old silent movie. So my mother was in the minority. She was 14 years old when sound came in. So see, she had grown up 14 years. She went to movies every week, 2 or 3 times a week. So she was a great fan of the silent film, and I think that rubbed off on me.